Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Mandy Sally. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation and the host of our conversation today. I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation. It's a little bit different than what we normally talk about in the censorship series because we're going to be talking about employment and jobs and the intersection between all of that and censorship. It's not going to be as broad a policy or legislative focus as some of our conversations have tended to be. But I'm really looking forward to learning from all of my panelists here today. And I really appreciate all of you joining us. So I'm going to quickly introduce each of them in just a second, and then we're going to get right into our discussion. But before I do that, for those of you watching at home, please feel free to make use of that Zoom chat. Would love to hear where you're joining from today and also just your reactions to our conversation. So please feel free to drop comments or questions in the Zoom chat because we just love to hear your feedback as we get into our discussion. Also, any of the links or resources that our panelists mentioned today will go to all of you in a follow-up email that I send usually about 24 hours after our program. So you don't need to worry about furiously jotting anything down. I will send all of that to you in an email so you can just sit, enjoy, and listen to all the wisdom our panelists have for you. And lastly, this conversation will be on Woodhull's YouTube page. So if for some reason you can't stay for the length of our conversation today, it will be available on Woodhull's YouTube for you forever. So we would love for you to watch it again and share it with all of your friends and family because you're going to learn so much from our conversation today. So that's all the housekeeping. Let me quickly introduce who I have with us today, and then we're just going to get right into it. So first up, we have Charlotte Wynn. Charlotte is a queer femme of color, activist, and healer rooted in Los Angeles. Thanks so much for being with us, Charlotte. And then we have Joe Gao. Joe served as chancellor and communication study professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse from 2007 to 2023. Both Charlotte and Joe are going to share their personal stories with us today, and I really appreciate you both giving us some time and sharing those experiences with us. Then we have Zach Greenberg. Zach is the Faculty Legal and Defense Student Association Counsel at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression and a First Amendment attorney. And last but certainly not least, we have Lynn Ta. Lynn is a labor lawyer and community organizer in Los Angeles, Chinatown. And Lynn has represented sex workers and has been involved in litigation to protect sex workers' rights to unionize. So, absolutely stacked panel as usual, I must say. So, thanks everybody for being here with us today. And to kick us off, we're here today to discuss the connection between censorship and employment loss. And I want to start by hearing about a couple of our panelists' personal experiences. And so, Charlotte, I'm going to ask you to kick us off today. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your story with us?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mandy, and to Woodall for just giving us an opportunity to share our stories and, of course, for championing this cause. Yes, so in May of 2024, this year, I was working for an environmental justice organization. I was contracted to do diversity outreach to young folks, folks in the global south, people of color, and just engaging them in climate advocacy. And during that time, I would say it was like the like just before like 3 weeks before my like 6-month contract was about to expire, I was outed as a sex worker and as an adult content creator by just someone outside the organization. And a week later, the following week, I had a meeting with the HR director and the executive director, and they had let me know that they would be like ending my contract early due to budget issues. And just, they had made this excuse that, the organization was already underfunded and that they wouldn't be able to, continue on with my contract. They had also let go of somebody else, I think, on the admin team. But prior to this happening, to being outed, I had no reason to believe that I was underperforming. In fact, I was, one of the highest performers on my team, and doing all this outreach work, and you know, um, yeah, I just had no reason to believe that my job was in danger or anything like that. And regarding the individual, or individuals who had outed me, what had happened was they had sent like an email from kind of like a cryptic email address. It was like a proton mail, and they had sent it to my HR director, sorry, the executive director, who then forwarded it to the HR director, and attached to the email were photos um, of an OnlyFans account that I had from 2 years ago. It was closed at that point. Um, but the I think I had like written down what they wrote in that email. I sort of delayed in revisiting it because it's a difficult thing to talk about. But they had said in the email, I'm writing to you today to inform you of some illegal activity that a member of your organization may be engaging with. I'm sharing this out of concern for the organization and for the safety of the members of our community, especially any vulnerable youth that this individual may be engaging with. And so, yeah, I think something kind of important to note about this as well is that just the week earlier, um, there perhaps the same individual or the same group of individuals had sent an email with like screenshots from my Instagram account, where I was, advocating, where I was using my platform to speak up against the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There were, screenshots of some like posts, and me attending human rights events and protests and things like that. And there were accusations made that that was inappropriate, that I was a terrorist supporter. And so, I think because since that maybe didn't work, perhaps that they had moved on to like a different strategy. And I think, yeah, I think I was sort of taken aback by the lengths that they were willing to go to silence me. So yeah, that was a little bit of my story.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to hear that happened, and Joe, I want to hear about your experience as well, because I think there's some parallels between what you both experienced. But it's interesting in that email you shared that they used this language about children and safety, because that's the language we so often hear on a broader sort of legislative level regarding porn and explicit content online. So it sounds like they were kind of parroting some of that same language. So thank you for sharing that with us. And Joe, I'd love to flip it to you if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your experience with these issues.
Sure. Thank you, Mandy. I guess my experience is a little unusual because my wife and I, we wouldn't say we were sex workers, but we had a hobby of making explicit videos and putting them on the internet. And some of those we put on big free sites like X Hamster and Pornhub. And we genuinely thought nobody's going to notice this. I mean, there are millions of videos there, and why would anybody care about a middle-aged married couple? But the reality was that they did prove to be pretty popular. And I had a position, and really two jobs, if you will. One was the chancellor of a university, and then also a faculty member at that university. And so someone took it upon themselves, the leadership of the system won't say who, but to tip off the president of the university that I report to, the system and the Board of Regents. And they did have their lawyers ask me, is this your material? And I said, well, yeah, it is. And, we have a First Amendment, and we have academic freedom at the university. So I wasn't quite sure what they were going to do, but they very suddenly and publicly fired me from the chancellor position. This would have been in December of last year. And they called what I had done abhorrent and disgusting. which I would take issue with that. But I had already said I was going to retire as the chancellor, so I was all right with that. But what happened next was rather surprising. You know, I'm a tenured faculty member, and you're supposed to have broad freedom in that role. The system folks launched an investigation, and they ended up spending $130,000 on this investigation. We have the documentation of that. Zach and his colleagues at Fire, who have been so great in supporting me, I feel very lucky. You've seen that. And then they did have this long kind of trial where I had to try to defend myself against charges of unethical and illegal behavior and violating the technology policy. I mean, they really made up a lot of things, because the reality is I don't think you can fire a tenured faculty member for what they do on the internet. And Zach, it'll be great to hear his legal opinion on that. But in any case, I was ultimately fired from the tenured position. And, you know, I mean, my wife and I, we don't mind if people want to watch our videos. I mean, we get some pleasure out of that. But people who want to criticize us for making them, well, just don't watch them. You know, I mean, that's a pretty simple thing. And then this notion that, you know, young impressionable minds at the university would be influenced negatively by this is really laughable, because you have a generation now that has grown up accustomed to a world in which the adult sites are some of the most popular things on the internet. I mean, some of them are more popular than Netflix. So I think there's a real generational dimension here that's pretty concerning.
Yeah, well, you know what strikes me about both of your situations, although very different, is this idea that somebody went out of their way to track what the both of you were doing online and then present it to your employers, and call it, you know, you said abhorrent, Joe, is what they called it in your situation. You know, they called it dangerous and illegal in your situation, Charlotte. I think you said they even called you a terrorist for your comments around what's happening in Gaza. And, you know, it really strikes me that there's this deep seated stigma, I guess is the word, around any sort of like sexual content here in the United States, and that we can't be professionals, you know, either at a university or here in this nonprofit and be sexual beings online, right? Like those things too can't coexist, at least according to the two folks who took it upon themselves to invade your privacy, I would say, in both of these instances. And we're going to get into all the legal stuff, but, you know, Woodhull's a human rights organization, and we fight for people's human sexual freedom. And so before I get that, I wonder if either of you could just share a little bit about what were your feelings when this started to happen? You know, what came up for you when you found out that somebody had taken this information and brought it to your employer? And Joe, I'll start with you, and then Charlotte.
Well, it was, you know, it's funny because people say, well, you put your videos out there, so you should have known this would happen. And I didn't think this would become a national and international news story. And that's certainly not the attention that Carmen, my wife, and I wanted, you know, and it was really kind of interesting to see some of these media outlets were just so, let's get you know, like CNN. I did an interview with them, and the host was just, well, this is terrible and you should be ashamed, you know, kind of tone to it. I genuinely don't know where that comes from. I mean, I thought we were at a point in 2024 with technology being as it is that, you know, people pay attention to what they want to, and you'd think even the critics would say we have great freedom in our country to do that. I mean, there are other countries in the world where if I had done what I had done, I may have been killed. You know, it's so I just wish people would lighten up a little bit, but we didn't anticipate this sudden negative attention. It was really overwhelming, but you know, we can handle it. We're very privileged that, you know, I'm 64 years old, so I'm essentially retired, if you will. at this point, but hopefully we'll get my job back. We'll see how that goes. We're going to have a lawsuit on that, but you know, it's not something we were seeking, and I really felt like, I guess maybe we were naive that there would be a spirit of, people that go to adult sites, they're there to enjoy adult videos, and what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But clearly there are people who are out there trolling around that want to get people like Charlotte and me in trouble. And I don't know, I guess they get some satisfaction from that. I'm not sure. I don't understand that.
Yeah. Charlotte, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Joe. I mirror many of those same reflections. And I think for me, upon realizing sort of what was happening after the initial shock, I think a feeling of fight or flight definitely came up. My natural tendency is fight. I'm former stripper. I mean, we're tough. We're tough cookies. And my initial reaction was to fight and say, I haven't done anything wrong. Um, Clearly there's like this sort of targeted campaign against me. And also, if you didn't want me engaging in sex work, then maybe you should pay me better, right? And so, I think that was my first inaction of like, I haven't done anything wrong. And then, as time sort of went on and I went throughout my day, I think a sense of fawning started to happen. And, as sex positives, as I try to be, and, I myself am an advocate for erotic labor and intimate labor and just how much we contribute to society, I too have my own internalized shame and horophobia, and that definitely started to come up. And the more that I sat with it, I think what I felt was a sense of betrayal, that it didn't really matter how many like hours of devotion and dedication I gave to this work. It didn't matter that I was an incredible project manager, an incredible outreach professional. This one email from a random person outside the organization mattered more than my contributions to the movement and to the work. And the last thing I'll say about that was my sort of sense of shock of the lack of maybe compassion or class analysis around why I and others in my position, other women and femmes of color, are engaging in sex work in the first place, right? I think there was a story last year that blew up around a teacher who was fired for having an OnlyFans account, and it's like, well, why did she need to have an additional stream of income in the first place, right? And at that point, I had engaged in so many different types of different kinds of sex work since college, because I am just like anyone else. I'm trying to build my career and build my dreams as a nonprofit professional, as a service professional. I just have a ton of student debt, right? And you see this all the time working, when I was working in strip clubs, we have law students, medical students, nurses, right? We're all brilliant. We're all so intelligent, maybe more intelligent than the average civilian even. We're just poor, or we're just under resourced, right? So yeah, I think that the sense of betrayal, certainly. And yeah, that's probably the biggest thing that I felt in the aftermath of that.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that. I think it's important to understand the real ways in which these situations impact people's lives. And you both shared that so poignantly. So I appreciate that. So one of the goals of this series is to illustrate the negative impacts of censorship, and your stories demonstrate not only the real world impacts, but the shame and stigma that folks engaging in any sort of sexual expression, in this case online, face every day. And so Zach, I want to ask you, from a legal point of view, what kind of speech or First Amendment violations are illustrated by Joe and Charlotte's experiences?
Yeah, sure. Well, as Americans, they have a fundamental constitutional right under the First Amendment to express themselves in any manner they see fit, and that includes controversial expression that they may have a sexual nature. And throughout the history of really the world, expression that is controversial and sexual nature has been really persecuted and stifled by the authorities that be, whether it's the Catholic Church 1,000 years ago, or even around the nation, around the world today. Like Joe alluded to, many countries punish things like homosexuality with death penalty or adultery, and it's just simply not okay in many places in the world to have divergent sexual views and opinions and expression. And right now, here in America, as Joe's case and Charlotte's case illustrate, this is still a hot button issue. And at Fire, we defend all speech protected by the First Amendment. If it's protected, we defend it, and we take a particular view of sexually charged expression, such as creating pornography, sex work, whatnot, what have you, online. And this expression has always been, like I said, very controversial when it comes to universities, especially in conservative states and conservative areas of the country. But the expression does remain fully protected by the First Amendment, by free speech principles. As a larger matter, we hope that even if there's no legal case or legal right to the expression, as a normative matter as society, we want people to be free to express themselves to the fullest possible manner. Because sex work and sexual expression is part of our society. It's extremely popular and extremely lucrative. And the last thing we want to see is employers and corporations be punishing their employees simply for expressing themselves, and especially when it comes to off hours and their private capacities in a manner that doesn't affect their work performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lynn, from your perspective, are there any workers' rights issues that you see kind of brought up by these two situations?
Yeah, I mean, so many workers' rights issues here that I feel like, so one thing I will say is, and I apologize if I sort of get too much into the weeds of the legal analysis here, but right now we don't have a whole lot of laws that protect this kind of activity, right? This is perfectly legal moonlighting activity that happens away from the workplace. And the First Amendment only applies to, if you are working for a public employer, the First Amendment only applies if your employer is a public entity. So this is like a government agency, right? In many cases, though, a lot of workers don't work for public entities. They work for private employers. And the First Amendment does not apply to private employers. So that's why that's sort of the difficulty oftentimes of asserting First Amendment rights, is because a lot of the times people are working for, corporations, nonprofits, and you can't assert that right there. There are those certain laws. So this is when we go into state laws, though. There are certain state laws, depending on which state you're in, that does say that have a carve out that says that, well, actually, the First Amendment can apply to private employers. So for example, in California, there is a presumption of at-will employment, right? So this is sort of like the least protection. It's where the employer can fire you for any reason at all. It's not they can't fire you for just cause. It's at will. But California also has this provision in its labor code that says that that gives the labor commissioner authority to seek remedies for an employee who's been discharged or disciplined for lawful conduct occurring during non-working hours away from the employer's premises. Now, there hasn't been a whole lot of litigation to kind of flesh out what some of those terms mean. So we are a little bit in uncharted territory right now in terms of, seeking wrongful termination claims for being fired for having an OnlyFans page. So that's kind of legally, that's where we're at right now. But I will say that sort of aside from the legal issues, and this is me sort of putting on my organizer hat, I think that I want to kind of address the equity issues that Charlotte brought up, which is that this type of termination, discipline, retaliation for sex work, does disparately impact a subset of the population, right? Which is usually oftentimes women or, femmes, and the LGBTQ plus community, right? And the trans community. And so, if we're talking about sort of civil rights, EEOC Title VII claims, I think this is an area where where there is a disparate impact on this community. And there's also just in general this sort of devaluation of this type of labor, this type of Charlotte had alluded to sort of this care labor, right? That sex work often is. And I think there's an incredible stigma against this type of work. I actually was involved in litigation where an employee was disciplined for making a joke about OnlyFans in front of his coworkers. It was just, it blew my mind. But I think that there is this incredible stigma towards this type of work, and especially when you get children and youth involved, that just ramps up the stigma, right? And it's often used as a pretext to retaliate against sex workers. So.
Yeah, I appreciate both of those perspectives. And, something you brought up about state law, Lynn, is really interesting. It's something we end up talking about in every censorship program, I feel like, is that your rights are different depending on your zip code. And that can be really, this is probably putting it lightly, but like really unfortunate, right? So, I wonder, Joe and Charlotte, how has engaging in adult content, both online and offline, in your case, Charlotte, affected your ability to engage in other forms of speech or advocacy outside the industry, if at all? And Joe, I'll start with you.
Well, it's interesting because I don't know that I set out to be a free speech advocate beyond, being an academic person and talking about it in that way. But now it's kind of like, as like Charlotte said earlier, fight or flight. I don't really want to shrink back from this. I mean, it really matters. And I guess what has come to light, I mean, I think if they had not fired me from my faculty position, I'd say, hey, at least in higher ed, the system works, But when they did that, it's like, whoa, this can't stand. And I'm actually kind of a little surprised, but I think it might be a measure of how scary the climate is now, that there haven't been more faculty groups who have said, hey, we support him and what you're doing to him is wrong. I mean, it was really a mind blower that the trial they had a faculty group of 5 faculty, and they got them all to say, yeah, fire him. I mean, that's probably never happened before. That in these controversies in the past, they tend to, the faculty say, we don't think you should let the person go, but then they find a way to do it anyway. But this was really interesting in that people are, I think they're just really afraid right now for jobs. And I mean, that's why I'm glad you're doing this discussion, because I think we really need to resist the direction that this is headed.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree, but I'm quite biased in this respect. Charlotte, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess it's very similarly to Joe. I never really saw myself as like necessarily a sex work advocate before, this sort of happened. I think, I'm often like invited to speak about other things, but this kind of topic in particular is still very kind of sensitive for me, because I realized that, for us, we're just making content, we're just having fun, we're just like exploring ourselves and our identities, but for other people, it's just this huge charged thing. There's so much emotional charge around it. And so, I think in my own life, I'm learning to develop the language around it, meeting people where they are around their own internalized shame and stigmas around this topic, but also, standing firm in that, like, I want to live in a world in which we can be able to speak about these things freely, and where topics like consent and sex and intimacy are not hidden in the shadows. I think the irony in someone like Joe being dismissed as chancellor of a school is like, there's actually so much like sexual misconduct, like actual sexual misconduct, and all sorts of shady stuff that happens in universities, in the workplace, in, the nonprofit sector, in the service industry, right? Actual children, and so, yeah, if we can find a way to speak about these things, bring them to light so that we can really harness our energy for the work that really matters. I think, yeah, it's something that really inspires me to want to be brave and speak out a little bit more.
Well said, Charlotte. Particularly, I'm thinking of the recent election, and I think there's going to be quite a bit of fights ahead of us, and I would love to preserve that energy for the sort of collective fight we've got coming our way. Okay, so Lynn, you spoke a little bit about this in your last answer, but I'm wondering, in situations like these, what can affected people do? Is there sort of legal standing to address employment loss after being outed for these experiences? Of course, we know there's a lawsuit happening with you, Joe, but I'm just sort of wondering what standing, what sort of rights do people in these situations have? Zach, I'll start with you.
Absolutely. So I think if an individual is subject to this kind of treatment, they have several tools that they can use to defend themselves. And we're not just talking about legal rights, lawyers, the First Amendment, stuff like that. It's always going to be a remedy, right? Organizations like FIRE and Woodhull exist to fight that. But I think one of the most powerful tools that people can use is to tell their story, is to bring attention to the abuse, to show the world what happened, because many times the perpetrators here, they control the narrative, right? They're saying that these employees are like, to use the words that Joe and Charlotte describe, it's it's disgusting, it's immoral, it's a threat to the children. They're ones that are kind of pushing the story here, and a lot of times all people see, it's all they know about this case. You have a chancellor fired for doing pornography with his wife, right? You have an employee fired for OnlyFans, right? And I think a really powerful tool we have is the power of persuasion, of public opinion, getting our story out there, amplifying our message, and really controlling the narrative. I know it's kind of a PR answer, but from what I understand, this is how we change hearts and minds, by showing people that this is expression, this is part of our society, this is not inherently evil or morally wrong. This is what people do, and in many ways, it is protected. And one of the most powerful tools that FIRE tries to use is to put people in their shoes. What if you were fired from your job for doing what you love to do and your passions, your hobbies, right? That happen to you, can happen to anyone. One of the advocacy letters we wrote for Joe Gall said that all faculty across the nation should be, disturbed by what's happening to the tenured faculty member in Wisconsin. Even if you're in New York or California or Wisconsin, these issues are happening across the nation. And telling our side of the story, bringing attention to it's often the most powerful tool we have. Because this comes to many universities, what they do in private can't be justified publicly. And bringing sunlight into these institutions, showing some transparency here, it's one of many cases over the years, without even having to file the lawsuit.
Yeah, call out the bad actors.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Lynn, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Zach said. I think that's so important to just kind of raise awareness that this is happening, because let's face it, the reality is, if Joe or Charlotte had been volunteering at, at an elderly facility, moonlighting doing that, and they were outed, like there would obviously be no repercussions for that, right? So It's pretty clear that this is something that has sort of like a moral overlay to it, right? That people think, or, that the stigma of that. But I would say also, in addition to that, yeah, there are lawsuits, right? I mean, as I mentioned, in California, if you're in California, you could file something with the labor commissioner. It's Labor Code 96K, it says that if you're discharged or disciplined, for this kind of lawful conduct that happened away from the workplace, you can at least attempt, right, to seek some sort of remedy. Again, the case law isn't fully fleshed out on that, so we don't know where it will go, but you can certainly at least try to do that. And then also just, I think what folks have been doing is, in terms of just legislative advocacy too, political advocacy, and maybe trying to, change the law that it's in a way that seeks more protections for workers who do this kind of work. So.
Yeah, for sure. I also, as you were speaking, Lynn, I was thinking OnlyFans, I know, OnlyFans is not the only place where people sexually express themselves online, but that platform exploded in popularity during COVID lockdown. And I just, have to think, if everybody on OnlyFans, either a subscriber or a content creator on that platform, were to speak out about these things, I feel like there would be a huge movement, right, to not let this kind of stuff happen. Just the sheer volume of folks involved on that platform and other platforms. But I wanted to ask, outside of legal lawsuits and advocacy and all that stuff, Charlotte and Joe, if there's somebody listening who's experiencing something similar, or they're afraid they could experience something similar, do you have any advice or like any wisdom for them, having been through it yourselves? Joe, I'll start with you, and then Charlotte.
Well, again, I'm in a rather extraordinary position, but one of the things that they tried, they being the people who fired me, to get me to do very early on, and no offense to our attorneys here, but they wanted me to go out and spend money on a lawyer, and then it would be the typical thing that they do in their world. They just get you in, like, let's say I had to spend like $20,000, then they'll say, well, hey, we'll pay those fees and you retire and go away. And so I would be very careful at what point you engage an attorney, because these are skilled, busy people, and you want to make sure it's at that right moment. And I was very, very lucky. As I said earlier, that fire came to my rescue, really, and has great people like Zach and other people that have legal backgrounds that know how to get things done, and I'm not having to pay anything for that. And so I can't begin to express my gratitude. But if I had had to have hired an attorney early on, I probably wouldn't have been able to last, because that's the way these big organizations, they just have unlimited financial resources. So it really is, I guess that would come down to who's your employer and what are they going to do, and so on. Now, again, you mentioned, Mandy, I'm at a public university, so there's a strong First Amendment protection there that people who are at private enterprises would not have. So again, I'm very fortunate in that regard. The other thing that we haven't talked about is, and I don't know that there'll be a lot of sympathy for me, but because they did what they did so publicly, I didn't have time to really communicate with my family about what's going to happen here. And that has caused, I've really, that's kind of shattered my family. And that'll never really get fixed. So I think you really got to be prepared for some real mean spirited stuff. And it's just really unfortunate that, and the thing that blows my mind is some people are just totally fine with all of this. And I get messages, my wife and I, from people all around the country and the world saying, we support you, and what you do is your own business. And then there are just these people that are so intractable in a very negative way that I want to say to them, what do you think you're going to accomplish? I mean, it's just really sad how there seems to be an interest in perpetuating this shame around our sexuality, which is just such a natural and beautiful thing when it's between consenting adults. And I always stress that. I mean, that we're not trying to advocate for anybody being forced to do anything, but if people want to do things together and they're consensual, then that should just be unquestioned. And it's really sad that there are people who still persist in shaming that.
Yeah, well, and I think, you make a good point, Joe, that kind of builds on what Lynn had said earlier in our discussion about how folks who might be doing this because they need that second stream of income are not going to even consider consulting an attorney when something like this happens to them, because there are bills to be paid, right? So it's sort of like you have to just move on to the next opportunity, whatever that is. And it sort of feeds the silence that allows things like this to continue. So I think that was a really good point. And Charlotte, I'll throw it to you for any other thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I think very similarly to Joe, just kind of piggybacking off what you said around, the vitriol that you can experience and the shame, even if you're really confident in yourself and who you are and your purpose, it can take a toll on our mind, our body, our spirit, our mental health. After I was dismissed, like I found myself in a really dark place, just not knowing where to go and who to turn to. And I think this is where, like, it's so important to find community because as soon as I tapped in, into some local organizations that I am involved in, here in LA, we have SWAP LA, Sex Worker Outreach Project. They have support groups. They have like all sorts of like wellness events, healing events, mental health workshops. Sunday Fair is also a really wonderful local organization for adult performers or people involved in the adult industry. And as soon as I tapped into them, like every single person has a story like this. Every single person has some sort of, someone tried to blackmail them, like and, while it can be sad, it also can help offer some perspective that one, you're not alone, and two, you're going to be okay. You're smart, you're capable, you're talented, you've got guts, you've got grit, like you're going to find other work, you're going to be okay. And yeah, just the importance of finding community. And then the second thing, just briefly, that I'll share is, those of us who are engaged in erotic labor, intimate labor, people who are sensual beings, sex workers, I believe that we are an asset to any organization or work environment that we are a part of. Like engaging, I'll just speak for OnlyFans. We're talking sales, we're talking marketing, we're talking emotional labor, we're talking creativity. I mean, there's so much involved there's care work. And yeah, I think, it shouldn't surprise people why am I so good at my nonprofit work? Why am I so good at outreach? Why am I so good at engaging vulnerable communities, creating safe spaces for them to like become leaders and use their voice? It's not in spite of my sex work, it's because of my sex work. And so yeah, I just want to like affirm that, that you are an asset as a worker, yes, but just as a human being. And then I guess for employers or people kind of who want to be great allies, I think more than anything, like doing your inner work around unpacking your own whorephobia. And also there's so much emphasis, I think, on comprehension over compassion, right? Like comprehension meaning like, there's whenever this topic is engaged, it always becomes this sort of like moral, ethical, proverbial discussion. And it's just so far removed from just the actual lived experience of people. Like for me, it's just a matter of like, can we have compassion and nuance for the complex ways in which people are just simply trying to survive or just just trying to survive or make their ends meet, right? And yeah, so I think prioritizing compassion over comprehension is so important when engaging this topic.
Well said, Charlotte. I love that, compassion over comprehension. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about sort of reacting to a situation like this. What can we do, if somebody has already experienced something like this? But I wonder if there are solutions that we can keep in mind to stop situations like this from happening, to begin with. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm wondering if we could think creatively, or maybe from a legal perspective. Lynn, what are your thoughts about how we maybe prevent something like this from happening again or to someone else?
Well, I mean, I say this as, a labor lawyer who has, worked with labor unions a lot, but, often, a unionized workplace provides better protections for workers, and what you could do now is you have this, you have collective bargaining agreements where you can negotiate all kinds of terms in there, and collective bargaining agreements are becoming more expansive in terms of what, the things that they're seeking from their employer. And one of the things that can be negotiated into a contract is, just sort of what the terms of discharge and retaliation can be, whether you want to, build that into a contract or not, about, whether an employer has to discharge for just cause, whether they can discharge for moonlighting activities, whatever that may be. I mean, obviously that would require the workplace to be unionized in the first place, which, can be a hurdle. But like I said, contracts are becoming very creative now. They have, people are negotiating subsidies for like housing and all kinds of things. And, and I do want to say, when stuff like this happens to sex workers, when they are terminated, it's not just the jobs that they lose, right? I've seen situations where it's impacted other areas of their lives, right? They've lost housing because sometimes landlords find out about the work that they do and think that there's like illegal things happening in the unit they're renting, and so they evict people, or they try to evict people, or even in immigration contexts too, right? Like stuff gets reported then to immigration, and again, a very vulnerable population, undocumented sex workers, which happens a lot. I mean, it's in a lot of the Chinatowns in New York and Los Angeles. And so I think sort of kind of preemptive, yeah, like we could, if you can unionize your workplace, build stronger worker protections through a collective bargaining agreement, but also just, again, legislatively, we could build stronger protections for workers. I think that would help to preempt a lot of that, but that would require a lot of organizing, right? A lot of that collective work. So.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we have a few organizers in the crowd. So organizers to the front. We have a new project for you, as if you're not busy enough already. Zach, what about you? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, totally agree with Lynn that stronger protections, both legislatively and through contracts, are a great solution to this problem, right? I hope that in our society in the future that we have all contracts truly in any profession where employers are not able to fire individuals for their outside expression, especially on public issues, their things like their voting record and what they do in their spare time. That would be, I think, an ideal society. But and going a bit broader than that, yes, and I think a solution here long term would be about developing a culture of free speech, that the recognition throughout society, through our colleges, our courts, our corporations, that people have views different than we do, that they exist in a country of 300 million people, and that the recognition that we need to defend those views, we need to defend the right to express those views, because it could happen to us one day. And that fire, that's one of our goals and our objectives, to create this culture of free speech, not only in our university, but in our society at large. And we believe that that would go a long way towards creating more tolerance and acceptance for things like sex work and even other views that people may think are offensive or controversial. And we know this is a long-term project, not going to happen overnight. We live in a deeply polarized society, new government, obviously, a result of the election, and we hope that because of these changes, because of the shifting nature of power, people come to realize the value of free speech and of protecting the right to civil liberties, regardless of who is in power, regardless of whether it's you, your friends, your family, even your adversaries, because these rights, these principles protect all of us equally.
Yeah, and I would add, in addition to First Amendment free speech protections, the right to free expression is a part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Absolutely.
So free expression is a human right as well as a civil right, by the First Amendment. Yeah, and I want to say this conversation today is focused a little bit on sexual expression, but there are lots of kind of expression I think that gets similar treatment in various jobs. I think particularly around what's happening in Gaza, right? I think we've seen a lot of folks have negative repercussions for speaking up around those issues. I won't get too much into that, but I just want to say that this is not specific or unique to sexual expression. It does happen. And so I like the idea that we can work towards changing the culture, right? We got to play the long game when it comes to some of these things. So I really appreciate that. Okay. And similarly, is there any kind of advocacy we as sex positive, free speech loving folks can be engaging in to destigmatize online sexual expression? This is sort of a broad question that I'm going to open up to all of you. And Lynn and Zach, you've given us some really good examples so far. But I love to leave our audience with some inspiration and some action items for folks who, maybe can't engage in those specific ways. So any thoughts about kinds of advocacy folks in the audience who are feeling inspired could engage in to destigmatize? And Joe, I'm just going to pick on you first.
Well, I'll tell the story. We had our videos on OnlyFans and Loyal Fans, and nobody really paid a whole lot of attention. And then we shifted over to free sites, Pornhub and Xhamster, and it just took off. And so when this whole scandal broke or was created, really, I mean, I think that was something that the media and the system people did. We said, oh, okay, we'll back off a little bit and take down the free videos. Well, now we put them back. And the reason we did is we're just, people are just going to have to deal with it. I mean, and I know that sounds a little glib, but I don't know any other way than to just say, hey, this is just not a bad thing, and we're willing to stand with it and take pride in it. And the videos get like 500 to 1,000 views every day. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who are enjoying them. And so I guess that would be the small part that we're playing, is to just say, we're not going to, repent and apologize because we didn't do anything wrong. And our society needs to come along. Unfortunately, I don't see it in the political leadership and on either end of the spectrum, really. The people that investigated me were Republicans, and the people that fired me were Democrats. And I think it's going to take some real courageous, probably younger leadership to say, let's really talk about these issues. And is this, is sex work a crime? I mean, it is not. There's no victim there, and we have to deal with that. And I guess with the legalization of marijuana, if you're my age, that was really I'm 64 years old, something to see that something that was just considered horrific at a point in time is now really commonplace. And wouldn't it be a better world if we could get there with sex work and sexuality and pornography and just things that people enjoy? I think we'd have a much calmer world. I think there are a lot of people who are very sexually frustrated and wound up, and there are these movements that are saying, I'm a man and I'm involuntary celibate and I'm mad. And I mean, there ought to be an outlet for somebody in that position. And now I worry that you see in the aftermath of the recent election, this 4B movement where women are saying, well, then we're not going to have sex and we're not going to have men. And, I don't think that's the answer. The answer is to get into talking about this and, just trying to make people a little more comfortable with their sexuality.
Thanks, Joe. Charlotte, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would just say, even as challenging as this experience has been for me, like I know it could be so much worse for people who are trans or Black or brown or undocumented. Like, I myself have so many privileges. I'm educated, I'm documented, I speak English, right? Like, I have, even being able to navigate both the professional sphere and the adult industry, being able to just kind of go back and forth between the two is itself, a huge privilege. There are some people who, like, they've just been totally locked out of the professional class and, educational class, and just not, like, sex work is their only form of work, right? They can't, it's difficult for them to be able to have social mobility in that way. And so, if you feel like you can, and if you feel called to just continue to share your story, I know that topic has been brought up multiple times during the session. I think it's for a good reason, because the more that we can just have transparency around this topic, even if you aren't involved in, like, sexual labor per se, just if you're a sensual being, just if you feel you have any kind of safety or privilege to be able to just talk about sex, right? Like, I think that can play a role in just destigmatizing the topic in general. But for those of us, within this industry who do have privileges, to be able to talk about it and take a stand for those who may not have as many privileges. And yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing, is that there are voices within this conversation, that there are voices that are missing even within this conversation, right? And I think similar to Joe, in some strange way, this experience has been a small kind of blessing for me, in that it just totally, respectability is just not something I'm interested anymore, because I tried so hard to just button it all up. I tried so hard, to just keep these things separate, and, like, yes, I do this thing, but also, like, I'm such a good worker, and, like, the 10 years of experience I had in nonprofit, all the sacrifices and devotion that I gave to the cause, it didn't really matter at the end of the day. At the end of the day, I was always just going to be seen as a whore. And in some way, it gave me this freedom to just, okay, well, now I'm just going to go back to sharing pretty photos of me on social media, right? And the right people who stick around will stick around. I still get invited to speaking engagements. I still find work, right? Like, I haven't totally been, cast aside. The people that get it will get it. And the people who are, still concerned about respectability and, like, just weird around sex, like, maybe to Joe's point, like, that kind of leadership is going to start to phase itself out, so yeah, you will find your people if you just stay authentic to who you are.
I agree. Zach or Lynn, any final thoughts or calls to action before I wrap up our conversation?
Sure, I'll go and give Lynn the last word. Yeah, Charles, I totally agree with what you're saying. I remind you of a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, which I'm hoping to not butcher, and something along the lines of, do what you feel in your heart to be right, because you'll be criticized anyway. Right? You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You might as well, just go for it, right? Like, do what you want to do. And I just want to say, to answer the question, I'm truly grateful to everyone on this panel, including the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, because I think that the most important thing we can do to solve the problem is to just educate others about their rights, about what's happening here, bring attention to this issue, and having Joe and Charlotte share your stories, Lynn share your expertise. This is how we create change. This is how we make a better society. So I think probably the most important way we can do that. And those who want to learn more about their rights, and those hear that, and on the audience that do care about free speech, First Amendment, and these issues, giving a shameless plug here to visit thefire.org, my organization's website. We have just a treasure trove of information there about data, your rights, guides, research, surveys, anything you want to know about that. It's all right there. And we'll have them share my email as well. So happy to chat about any of these issues. And of course, if you feel your rights are violated, contact us. Happy to help out, like we did with Joe. We want to hear from you.
Yeah. Thanks, Zach. And thanks for always the folks at Fire answering my frantic emails when I need a First Amendment expert. It's much appreciated. Lynn, any final thoughts?
Well, I also do want to plug FIRE because I just want to say I have consulted the website many times to do like know your rights training stuff. So it's extremely helpful. So thank you for doing the work that you do. I mean, I will just, reiterate, I think what folks have said here, to Charlotte's point about destigmatizing the conversation. I think, as like Joe and Charlotte have pointed out, just the ways that this kind of, sex work has been described, using words like abhorrent and disgusting. I think that there's this conception of sex workers as sort of like this peripheral subset of people who do this work, when really what we're finding is that this, like, a lot of people do it. It's, and as OnlyFans has shown, like, a lot of people consume it too. Like this is like in the fabric of our daily lives. And so being able to kind of destigmatize that, something that is, produced and consumed daily by regular people, and really shifting the window in terms of like how we talk about it, I think can really, bring about some of these changes that are, that we really need, and kind of clear away the roadblocks that prevent us from protecting these types of workers. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate all of you for sharing your stories, bringing your wisdom. I say this every month, but I really do learn a lot from these conversations. And so I really appreciate that you all took some time out of your day to share with all of us. So folks listening, thank you so much for tuning in. This will be on Woodhull's YouTube page, so you can share it with your friends and family, and get them to learn all about it. As I mentioned, I'll be sending an email with any links or resources mentioned, as well as ways to get in touch with all of my wonderful, fabulous panelists. So thanks everybody so much for being here, and I'll see you back here next month.
Thank you.
Bye.